Jamie here with Country Diggers. Today we're going into Pirates of the Florida Coast by Robert Jacobs, and we'll be reading chapter 13, Privateers of Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713. So stay tuned. All right, chapter 13, Privateers of Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713. At the end of the 17th century, everything changed for pirates and privateers. Public opinion swayed against them as the trial and execution of Captain Kidd sent strong repercussions through the continent. New laws were passed and government officials were replaced. By 1700, to be a pirate meant that you were a criminal, operating under a death sentence. For privateers, opportunities to get letters of marque were severely limited. That rapidly changed in just 2 years. In 1702, a major war broke out among just about all the European nations. It was called the War of Spanish Succession, and was primarily over the would-be king, who would be the next king of Spain. When the Spanish Charles II died with no children, the Spanish throne was claimed by two people: Archduke Charles, the son of Leopold I, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, and Philip, Duke of Anjou, the grandson of King Louis XIV of France. That's 10, 11, 12, 13, 16, I think. Louis XVI of France. Both were closely related to the former king. The war was fought on a very large scale with huge armies and naval engagements. Privateers also played a vital role. During the 128 privateer commissions were issued in Bristol alone. For the pirates of the world, the opportunity to become legal privateers had returned. Immediately at the start of the war, pardons for all pirates were offered on both sides, and letters of marque against their representative enemies were issued to anyone with a ship and a crew. This started the third era of the golden age of piracy, the privateers of Queen Anne's War. These privateers were generally all sailors, not a mix of sailors and soldiers as in the last century. Many captains and officers on the merchant ships became privateers either out of patriotism or economic necessity. But privateers were handled far differently than in the past centuries. They were far more controlled. Quite often, privateers were used to augment naval forces and sailed directly under their control. In other instances, reliable captains were selected to operate on their own, but under a very restrictive orders. These privateers would operate much like Royal Navy forces, with strict discipline and a command structure similar to regular navies. Among the most famous and successive privateers during that time was Woodes Rogers, who sailed around the world between 1703 and 1707. The only privateers who were permitted to operate independently did so on a very small scale. The anti-piracy trend that had begun in the 1700s continued and intensified by the war's end. Local laws were toughened and piracy was no longer tolerated by local merchants in most of the major ports. Pirates were now looked upon as unpatriotic criminals. Privateers were still welcome in most of the ports, but they didn't receive the hero-like fever from the local merchants that they had enjoyed in the 17th century. Their celebrating and carousing were now viewed as poor behavior. New York and a few other ports welcomed privateers, but restricted them to a few streets where their celebrating was controlled. Right at the start of the war, an event took place that set the stage for the rise of the pirates 13 years later. A major naval battle occurred. Vigo Bay, on the west coast of Spain, just north of the Portugal border. The English Royal Navy soundly defeated the French fleet, and Spain became concerned about an English attack of their treasure fleet. Spain decided to slow and eventually halt their yearly treasure fleet, which sailed from Havana. But treasure was still kept flowing into Havana from all of Spain's colonies in the New World and the Pacific. Even though Spain desperately needed money, the enormous wealth accumulating in Cuba would have to remain there until the war's end. In America, the War of Spanish Succession was called Queen Anne's War. Queen Anne was crowned in 1702, just as the war was getting underway. Queen Anne was well liked by her subjects and was a particularly good ruler. Under her influence, the army and navy became modernized, making Britain among the most powerful nations in the 18th century. To the colonists in America, the war was far more obscure than in Europe, and the meaning, purpose, and political goals were unclear. As far as the British colonists were concerned, Queen Anne declared war on the French and Spanish once again, and that was that. In 1702, the very first year of the war, a small Spanish invasion fleet attacked Charlestown, Carolina, and a few of the outlying settlements. But they were unable to do significant damage. In retaliation, 500 militia men from Carolina and 300 supportive Indians attacked the Spanish city of St. Augustine, Florida. After a 2-month siege, they were unable to take the main fortress, but they did manage to burn the city. During that siege, Andrew Ransom, who had been held a prisoner by the Spanish for 18 years, was finally released and returned to Charlestown with the fleet. In 1703, a combined force of French privateers and Spanish soldiers invaded the small English colony of New Providence in the Bahamas and totally overwhelmed the 250 English residents to capture the town. They returned to Cuba a few days later with 13 captured vessels and about 100 prisoners, including the island's governor, Ellis Lightwood. The Spanish and French again invaded New Providence in 1706. The main port of Nassau was sacked, leaving only 27 families living in small huts. In response, English privateers began arriving in large numbers. The war was at its height, and Port Royal, Jamaica, was too far away from the action, which seemed to be around Florida. That same year, just as the English privateers were becoming organized at Nassau, a large combined Spanish and French fleet sailed from Havana and attacked Charlestown again. But just as before, they were unsuccessful. These shots fired at the city's walls just seemed to bounce off. One interesting aspect excuse me, of the city's defenses was that the protective walls were made of pimento logs, which are fairly soft and fibrous. They were ideal for use as defense walls because the attacker's cannon shot could not break the wood apart. By 1707, Nassau emerged as the new privateer base. It was close to the main shipping lanes along the Florida Straits. Let me get some. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Okay, Nassau emerged as the new privateer base. It was close to the main shipping lanes along the Florida Straits. Additionally, the waters around the town were too shallow for large warships, and Spanish attacks would be limited to small vessels. Small pirate or privateer attacks along the Florida East Coast were rare during the war due to the large military presence from both the British and the Spanish. On the West Coast, the few meager Spanish and French colonies along the Florida Gulf Coast didn't attract shipping of any value, and consequently, privateer action in the Gulf of Mexico was almost non-existent. However, privateers must have had success taking shipping in the Florida Straits. It is possible that these Nassau privateers occasionally used some of the isolated inlets of the Florida East Coast to hide and ambush passing prizes. But if they did, once a prize was taken, they would have returned to Nassau with their captured cargo and money. The War of Spanish Succession, Queen Anne's War, ended in 1713 with the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht. King Philip V kept the Spanish crown, and most of the territory went back to pre-war status. However, the war had drained everyone's resources. At the same time, it had produced a large number of privateers who were now out of business. For the first time in 12 years, there was no war, and consequently no letters of marque to be had. For many of them, privateering was the only life they knew. Many of them temporarily returned to piracy and counted on another war breaking out soon, when they could return to legal privateering. But the professional privateer of the time, piracy was a way to make a living and stay in practice between wars. The only trick was not to get caught. Meanwhile, Nassau had continued to grow as a privateer base, and by the war's end in 1713, an estimated 200 families of settlers and 1,000 privateers called Nassau their home. Among these privateers were captains like Benjamin Hornigold, Charles Vane, and Henry Jennings, all who would become far more famous pirates over the next several years. Now, with the war's end, Nassau was a pirate base. But even though Nassau was the biggest pirate base of the day, it couldn't possibly compare to the bases of Tortuga or Port Royal as they were in the 1660s. In 1713, even with a fairly large population, the port itself was comprised of only a few small buildings, surrounded by a large group of rundown shacks. However, in just a few years, that would all change. All right, that was the end. And next time we will go to chapter 14, the 1715 treasure fleet. That's going to be a good one, so y'all stay tuned. All right.